Hello everyone and welcome to the Solo Gamers Club. This is Keith, and tonight I'm going to continue with my series entitled, If You Want to Know What It Was Like to Be Napoleon, Play This Game, where I will be highlighting the board game Napoleon Against Europe. Many strategic level games explore the Napoleonic Wars, but Napoleon Against Europe, especially when it's paired with GMT's CDG Solo system, stands out for its solitaire play. It delivers a remarkably accessible way to experience both the military and political dimensions of the era, offering real depth without overwhelming the player. The result is a rich, engaging system that fits comfortably within a reasonable playtime and table footprint. I'm hoping that this series will help to renew interest in this game, particularly among solo gamers drawn to the Napoleonic period. In part 2 of this series, we're going to look at the other aspects of what it was like to be Napoleon Bonaparte, as we investigate the mechanics of the interphase. During the interphase, we'll explore the diplomatic and production phases of the game, and we'll learn what it was like to be a diplomat during 19th century Napoleonic Europe. However, before we get started with that, I'd like to follow up with some additional details that occur during the activation phase, which deal with the flow of supply and the control of land provinces. I noticed in my first video in the series that I failed to address these vital rules regarding the control of zones and the effects of that on supply lines. Napoleon famously commented, "An army marches on its stomach," emphasizing that logistics and supply are as vital to victory as strategy and tactics. And this is faithfully represented in the design. He also reportedly remarked, "Amateurs discuss tactics, professionals discuss logistics." Zones on the map are either controllable or they are open to all. A zone is open to all if it does not have a port, city, or fortress. So an example of which would be this blank province that is south of Leon. That one is considered open to all. Now it begins under the control of the parent nation where it resides. So in this case, it is nominally under French control. These provinces that don't contain either ports or cities or fortresses could be considered rural areas that don't have a lot of population. Now, a zone that is open to all can never receive a control marker. If the location has a city or a fort or a port, military unit moving into that province can gain control of it. These areas are considered to be, if there's no opposing military units there, there's considered to be small garrisons there. So that parent country of that province would have nominal control over that province. So if we look at this example I've got set up here, we've got Ferdinand, and he's in a Austrian-controlled, formerly French city. Now, we have a zone that is open to all. Anybody can run supply through that. The only way to stop it is if an enemy force is in that zone. Now, in this case, Ferdinand would be blocked. He can't run supply through Marseille or Grenoble because those are under French control. And he can't run supply through that province that is open to all because now there is a French unit there blocking him. If that's not there, he can run supply through to Lyon. 2 movement points, 1 through the pass, 1 to get into Switzerland where he has a supply depot, 1 movement point into Zurich, which is under Austrian control, and then 1 movement point through the pass and 1 movement point into Innsbruck, which is in the national territory of Austria. So he would be under supply under this situation. But if the French moved a force into that zone that is open to all, now it is blocked. A zone is controllable if it has a fortress, city, or port. A controllable zone is always under the control of a power. A power controls a zone if it contains their control marker or the zone is within the national territory. In the case of a controllable zone inside of a friendly national territory, no control marker is required. So in the case of Marseille or Grenoble, which is in France proper, those are considered to be under French control unless an enemy force moves in there, spends a movement point, or besieges the citadel that is there. So as an example, say this was the case, Ferdinand is currently out of supply. So what he could do is activate, move his force across the bridge, move into Marseille, and he could besiege Marseille. We'll say that he gains control of it. So he'd be able to put control marker there. And then he could do the same. He would continue, say, his movement into Grenoble, besieging Grenoble, and that would allow him to, say, if he was successful, he could place a control marker in Grenoble. And then he would be able to run his supplies back through Lyon and then back through his supply line as we have demonstrated previously. So that's how those zones that are open to anyone or controllable will work in the game, and it has a very big impact on the supply lines. Now, an enemy force can take possession of a city by just simply moving in there and spending an additional movement point. So we'll say that Ferdinand wanted to activate and he moves into Toulouse. He can move into there. There's no enemy force there, but it is a city. So he could spend 1 movement point to take possession of that location. So he spends a movement point moving into Toulouse and another movement point to take possession of that garrison there. And then that's how he can continue with his perpetrating his supply lines. So it's a very important concept. I neglected to address that in the first video, but this is very, very important. And when you spend that movement point moving into, say, an enemy city location, and you spend that point to take control of it, that would represent that an enemy force would wish to run supply through that zone, and that would represent smaller forces guarding key roads within the zone and assisting in supply and logistics. Now, I should point out that a friendly force in a controllable zone does not in and of itself allow supply to be traced through the zone. A controllable zone must be under friendly control for a supply line to pass through the region. So, as an example, if, say, the Austrians did not have control of Montpellier, but, say, there was an Austrian unit there, that still does not allow him to run supply through for Ferdinand. He doesn't control it. There's a Austrian corps there, but it is not controlled yet. You must get control in order to run supply through there. Another area that I'd like to touch on is the conquests phase. In this phase, we will check to see if any minor powers have surrendered, and then the same check will be performed for major powers. So for this example of a minor power being conquered, we'll use Bavaria as the example. The capital of Bavaria is Munich. So in order for Bavaria to be conquered, the capital has to be under that nation's control. So we'll say that Austria has control of Munich. We also have to have all of the fortresses within that nation to be under friendly control as well. So in order for Austria to gain control of Bavaria, they would need Würzburg and Ulm as well as the capital. That would signify that Bavaria has been conquered by Austria. Now, minor powers without units that surrender may be annexed or become allied to the conquering power. Minor nations with units that surrender will become allied to the conquering power. All of their land units are eliminated and returned to the reserve pool of the conquering nation, and all of their naval units are permanently eliminated. So in the case of Bavaria, which is a minor power with units, Bavaria would now become an ally of Austria, and Austria would be able to build any Bavarian units that are in the force pool. Now, in the case of a major power, it's slightly different. You'll notice that using Austria as an example, Austria has two provinces with these gold stars, and those are considered key zones. Now, in order to conquer a major power, you have to have control of the capital of the country. So in this case, Venice would have to be under, say, French control. In addition, you need to have all of the key zones under control as well. So in the case of France, they would also need to control Prague as well. But there is an exception. If you control the capital and at least one key zone, and that country doesn't have an army on the board, you don't need to control the remaining key zones. In this case, if France controlled the capital and the key zone associated with it, and there's no Austrian army on the board, France would have conquered Austria during the conquest phase. Now, in order to conquer a location, you have to have a valid supply line back to your home country. So any forces that you have in the case of Vienna would also have to have a valid supply line going back to France. Something such as this, where we can have a valid supply line back to Belfort. Now, when a major power surrenders, the conquered major power and its unconquered minor allies immediately enter a forced peace with the conquering power. They remain allied to each other. So in the case of, say, an Austrian collapse, it has other allies on the board. It has the Papal States and Thuringia. So those provinces would surrender along with the parent company. So if you're allied to Austria, any provinces that are with Austrian flags on them that are labeled on the board, those are allies, they would also surrender at that time. Now, as a part of a surrender, the conquering power gets to select 3 provinces, effectively removing the provinces from the national territory of the conquered nation. These provinces must be adjacent to the national territory of the conquering power and may not include key zones within the conquered nation. So as an example, if you had Austria being conquered, part of that peace treaty that is going to be in effect would allow France to take over some Austrian national territory. So in the case of Austria, we'll say that France chooses the province of Venice and Salzburg and Innsbruck. Those become part of French national territory, so they're going to be marked with national territory markers for France. And that is a big advantage in the future for the conquering nation. The limitation is you cannot select any province that is a key zone. So France could not select Prague or obviously Vienna. Now, when a nation is under a forced peace, the conqueror cannot attack that country again until after the term of the forced peace has ended. And at the same token, the conquered nation cannot declare war on the conquering nation for that period of time. Now I'm going to bring up on the screen the major nations diplomatic chart that I created for solitaire play. You'll notice that along the top there are the national flags of each of the major powers. Then along the left side we've got the following designations of diplomatic status. They're either empire, forced ally, forced peace, neutral, or they're part of the coalition. So when a nation is conquered, like say in the case of Austria, they would automatically be moved to the forced peace category for Austria. And forced pieces will be checked at the conclusion of every year after the forced peace is instituted. At the end of the conquest phase, a die is rolled for each major power which has surrendered one time and has been in a forced peace for 1 or more years. On a result of 5 or 6, that power will revert to neutral status. And then the exceptions for declaring war on their opponents are removed. Now we're going to add +2 to the roll if the major power has been in a forced peace for 2 or more years. So the forced pieces could last as little as 1 year or could last indefinitely. Depends on the die roll. Now if a forced peace power surrenders for a second time, it's going to remain in a forced peace for the remainder of the game. And if a major power is conquered by the empire player, the empire player can discard a card to force that power into a forced alliance if one of the following conditions is met. The drums of war event has been played, or the empire has conquered the major power for a second time. And there are many advantages to having a forced alliance. You get access to that power's units, which you can build and include in your armies as though they were, in this case, French units. So there's a big advantage to that. So that's going to finish the continuation from the previous video. I wanted to cover those areas that I neglected to cover in the first video. Now we're going to move into discussing the interphase. And some of the most interesting portions of the game occur during the interphase of each year. And they involve diplomatic actions and national production. In these phases, eligible cards may be played to assist in national production and provide modifiers to diplomatic actions taken during the phase. The card's used marker is adjusted just as though a card were played as a part of the activation phase, thus limiting the number of cards available to the faction during the coming activation phase. Now, in order to simulate the two-player game appropriately, following the card hand phase, each faction will temporarily draw a number of cards from their deck equal to their current hand limit, minus the number of the permanent cards and the number of face-up cards currently on their display. So if we moved into the interphase, right now this would be what the French have in this case. But in order to properly simulate this phase, we give access to the player temporarily for additional cards that he can use possibly during this interphase. So in this case, in this example, he has a 7-card hand limit, and there's a total of 4 face-up cards, including his permanent card. So that would allow the French to draw 4 additional cards that he can temporarily use during the interphase. 7 cards would be 3 that are available, plus these 4 temporary cards that he drew, giving him a hand of 7. And he would be able to play these cards possibly during the diplomacy phase or during the budget phase. So in the case of, like this Cavalry of the Guard card, if we have this face up, it's available to us. We can use that during the budget phase to get the Cavalry of the Guard unit into one of our armies. But each card that we play is going to decrease. That'll be our cards remaining will drop. And that's going to directly affect how many cards we have available to us in the next game year. If any of these cards that we drew to supplement our hand size are not used, they will be shuffled back into the deck. So that's how that will be handled. So now we're going to discuss the interphase in more detail. And we start out with the declaration of war phase. The phase begins with the declaration of war phase. During this phase, the coalition and then the empire may declare war on any neutral powers. If a declaration of war is declared on a neutral power, they automatically declare war on any powers allied with that neutral. So as an example, if a player declares war on Saxe, they are also declaring war on Prussia and vice versa. Now, it's important to note that a power must declare war during this phase if they wish to attack the power later in that year. War cannot be declared during any other phase of the turn. So if France has completed its conquest of Austria during 1805, if it wishes to attack Prussia, it will have to declare it at this time, and then Prussia would become a part of the coalition at that point. When war is declared against a minor power, the power immediately deploys all of its available units on the board. The first time war is declared on a major power, the escalade level will rise by 1, and that is going to directly affect when those punishment cards will come into the game decks. Now, during the card hand phase, we're going to be using our card assignment table, and I will bring that up on the screen. This is a display that I downloaded from BGG, and it's very handy. I would recommend that you get a copy of this if you're playing the game. We're going to use that to calculate our maximum hand size for the coming year. This value may never be lower than 6 or higher than 10, with the exception of the Miseries of War card if that were played. A faction may discard any face-up cards on their display except for the Snare of Bayonne and the Continental Blockade cards, which cannot be discarded. During this phase, each faction may return their eligible permanent cards to their displays. And so once the card hand phase is completed, we move to the budget phase. And in the budget phase, each major power will collect and spend their resources that were collected during the previous year. This is done in reverse order, beginning with the Ottomans, and then Spain, then Prussia, then Austria, then Russia, Britain, and finally France. Minor powers do not receive resources, but may receive reinforcement steps. Budget phase cards must be played at the start of the phase before any power acts. Each major power receives resources according to the resource table. This number may be reduced if key zones of the power are controlled by an opponent. Minor powers do not receive resources. Instead, for every 2 minor powers with units, rounded down, that the player is allied with, that player receives 1 minor power replacement step. Minor power replacement steps can be used to deploy a reduced strength corps in its national territory or as a reinforcement step per the normal rules. During this phase, each major power using the current year must check the entry and exit dates of each of the generals in their countermix. Generals can be deployed from the force pool at no cost. Generals commanding armies may also be replaced at this time. So consulting the resource table, we intersect resources with the national major power. In the case of France, they are entitled to 14 production. Britain 6, Russia and Austria 12, Prussia 8, Spain 4, and Turkey 4. Now both Prussia and Spain can increase their production values to those on the right-hand side of the slash if they have conducted reforms or the War of Liberation has been declared, in the case of Spain. Units are purchased from the force pool using the production table, and that lists the type of unit and the cost per step. So as an example, during the budget phase, France has a production of 14 and they maintain possession of all of their key zones. So we give them 14 production points. Now France can use the production table and start purchasing reinforcements from their pool. Now the cost is per step. So as an example, if we wanted to buy a standard core and we wanted it to be 2 steps, we could purchase this 11th core. It's 2 steps. The cost is 1 per step, so that would cost us 2 production points. And then we would be able to add that as a part of our reinforcements. And we'll say France wants to purchase a fleet, so they will do that. It'll cost them 5 production points. And then let's say they will purchase 2 depots. Those will be a half a point each. That'll cost us an extra 1 point. France has 2 production left. You can't store any production, so you have to try to use this as much as possible. So in this case, with 2 production left, they will also produce the 10th core. Both steps, that will cost 2 points. And that's how the production phase will work. Now we also have an army that was available and a couple generals. Now those generals could be placed on the map for free, and there's specific rules as to where these reinforcements can come in. You can place up to 2 into a supplied army anywhere on the board. But the rest of your reinforcements have to be in your home country. Now at this time, we can also play cards that are a part of this phase. In this case, the French could play the Cavalry of the Guard card. That can be played during the budget phase. And it says place the special French cavalry unit +2 with Napoleon's army if in supply. So we could add the French Guard cavalry to the Grande Armée, wherever it is on the board, as long as it is supplied. The card would be played, and we would have to reduce our cards remaining by 1. That's going to directly affect the cards that we'll have available in the next year. Next, we'll move on to the diplomatic phase. Beginning with the coalition and then the empire, each player may perform 2 of the following actions. Attempt a diplomatic action to ally themselves with a power, play a diplomatic event, turn an allied minor power into a protectorate, or end a foreign war. Now, to attempt a diplomatic action, a card with a minimum AP value must be played. 1 AP to target a minor without units, 2 AP to target a minor with units, or a 3 AP to target a major power. The target of the diplomatic effort cannot be a protectorate, a coalition ally, a French minor ally during the epic period, a major power that is allied with the opposing player, or major powers in a forced peace or forced alliance. So what will happen is, during this phase, we can use cards for their resource value and use those to attempt diplomatic efforts to any nations on this diplomatic table. Cards that are specific to the diplomacy phase can also be played at this time. In this case, we have the Talleyrand card. And that says, a free diplomacy action with a bonus of +2 to the die. Only a minor may be targeted during the activation phase. So if we played Talleyrand during activation, we could only target a minor power. But we can use Talleyrand during the diplomacy phase and get a +2 modifier to the roll. So in this case, we'll say that France wants to target diplomatically Denmark. Denmark is usually a little more friendly to France, so they're going to gain a +1 modifier to the roll because of their diplomatic bonus, and they'll also gain the +2 from Talleyrand, so we'd be getting a +3 to the die roll. Now, in order to have a successful diplomatic action, we need a result of 6 or greater. So we would roll a d6 and then add in any modifiers that we have, and that would tell us whether we are successful or not. In this case, if we're targeting Denmark, we need a 6. So we've got the roll of 5, +1 for our diplomatic bonus, +2 for Talleyrand. So that means that Denmark has come to the French side, and we would mark them as part of the empire. Their forces would be placed on the board, and we'd be able to use those in the next year. Now that diplomatic effort could also be used on a major power. And in the case of this Talleyrand card, we don't have to play a card. We can, because it says it's a free diplomatic action. And in the case of Turkey, for France, it's a +1. So the same situation would happen. We'd roll the die, a 3, +1 is 4, +2 is 6, and Turkey would come on the side of the empire in this case. Now, if we don't have the Talleyrand card, we have to play a card from our available hand that has at least a value of 3 or greater. So in the case of Turkey, we would need to play a 3-value card in order to attempt that diplomatic action on a major power. So we'd have to play a card something like this, Indies. It's worth 3. That would be played. The card would be reduced from our cards remaining on our CDG Solar System display, and then we would be able to make the diplomatic effort. That's how this works, and this is actually probably one of the most fun parts of the game is these diplomatic actions. Now I've created 2 displays to help me with these very complex diplomatic situations that will occur during the game. We have one for neutrals without armies and one for minor nations with armies. And we're going to use little wood blocks to mark the status of each of these countries, either national territory, French ally, neutral, or coalition ally for nations without armies, or for minor nations with armies, the same situation. We'd mark them for French protectorate, French ally, neutral, or coalition ally. And we can use these displays during the diplomatic phase to see which nations we might want to target diplomatically to get them on our side. And nations without armies are still valuable because if they are converted to our side, we can use those nations possibly as supply areas. So the diplomacy in this is extremely important in preparing for the next year's military season. Now during this phase, we'll also conduct neutral major power movement. During the phase, players may move the units of neutral major powers. The Empire player will move the forces of Spain and Turkey if they are neutral, and the coalition player will move the forces of Austria, Prussia, and Russia if they are neutral. Neutral forces are moved up to their movement allowance and cannot leave their national territory. Fleets of neutral major powers may leave their national territory but must end their movement in a port in their national territory or a sea zone adjacent to a port in their national territory. So it gives you the ability to move some of the forces on the neutrals, and you would be able to position those to help defend those nominal allies of your coalition. Next, we would conduct strategic redeployment. And this is a very fascinating mechanism in the game. Instead of having to slog your units as you would normally, moving them from province to province, during this phase, players can move their units over long distances under certain conditions, and then we would do it in the following order: Turkey, Spain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, Britain, and then finally France. And what this allows you to do is to move your forces long distance. You're not able to enter provinces under the control of the opponent, but you can't be intercepted either. So you'd be able to move, like, say, your armies and supporting units near the borders of nations that you have just declared war on. In the example of, say, 1806, we'll say that France has declared war on Prussia. Well, they're able to use strategic redeployment to move a bulk of their forces to the operating area near Prussia. And this is a very interesting and very dynamic mechanism in the game. And so that pretty much covers the interphase in the game. In our next video, we're actually going to get started with the playthrough, and I'm going to show you how to use the CDG Solar System for Napoleon Against Europe. And I hope you've enjoyed this series so far. I'm trying to promote this game as much as I can. I hope I'm doing it justice. This is an excellent game for a solo player when combined with the CDG Solar System, and I don't think there's anything on the market that would allow you the playability to be able to play the entire campaign in a reasonable amount of time. The other games that are on the market, if you played those solitaire, they can be done solitaire, but they're generally going to be multiple dozens of hours to complete the campaign. This can probably be completed in, I would think, 10 hours or less, and you're going to experience the entire width and breadth of the Napoleonic Wars. So thank you so much for joining me at the Solo Gamers Club, and when we return to Napoleon Against Europe, we're going to start the playthrough, and we'll see how all of these elements come together to produce this very fine Napoleonic Wars board game. So this is Keith from the Solo Gamers Club signing off and wishing everyone a pleasant evening. Good night.